Have you ever met someone who said they wanted a healthy relationship, but as you got to know them, you realized the two of you were building from completely different foundations? Maybe one person was dating with purpose, while the other was simply going with the flow. Maybe one person was focused on intentions, while the other was operating from expectations. And before either of you realized it, frustration, confusion, disappointment, and miscommunication began to creep in. If that sounds familiar, today's conversation is for you. Grand Rise, humans. Welcome to High Level Intentions, a space dedicated to personal growth, self discovery, conscious living, and becoming the highest version of yourself. I am your host, Asanati Onita Zavi, and I am honored to have you here today. Whether you are listening while driving to work, preparing dinner, taking a walk, or quietly sitting with a cup of tea, thank you for allowing me to share this moment with you. My intentions for this podcast is simple: to create conversations that challenge us to think deeper, heal intentionally, grow consciously, and live purposefully. Because I truly believe that the quality of our lives is directly connected to the quality of our intentions. Today's topic was actually inspired by a recent experience that caused me to pause and reflect on something many of us encounter in relationships, friendships, business partnerships, and even within ourselves: the difference between intentions and expectations. Now, at first glance, these two words may seem familiar, but the more I sat with them, the more I realized that they create completely different experiences. Intentions are rooted in purpose. Expectations are often rooted in outcomes. Intentions focus on what are we cultivating. Expectations often focus on what we believe we should receive. And when two people are operating from different places, conflict becomes almost inevitable. As I reflected on a recent interaction, I noticed something that I believe many of us experience. Two people can genuinely desire connection. Two people can genuinely want companionship. Two people can even be attracted to one another, yet still be completely misaligned because they are approaching relationships from different perspectives. One person may be asking, "What are we intentionally building?" While the other person may be asking, "Why am I not getting what I expected?" Those are two very different conversations. So here's my personal story. So recently, I found myself navigating one of those in those moments. Not a dramatic situation, not a toxic situation, simply a moment where two people viewed relationships through very different lenses. At first, the conversation unfolded. I began to realize that what one person called consistency was not what the other person considered consistency. What one person viewed as effort was different from what the other person viewed as effort. And what one person considered a natural unfolding connection was very different from another person's intentional approach to building a relationship. That experience reminded me of something important. Compatibility is not just about attraction. Compatibility is about alignment. Alignment in values, alignment in communication, alignment in expectations, and most importantly, alignment in intentions. So, today I want us to explore a powerful question. Are you moving through life with intentions or expectations? And how might your answer be affecting your relationships, your healing journey, your business, your purpose, and your peace? Let's dive in. What are intentions? Now, before we can talk about expectations, we first have to understand intentions. So let's start with a simple question. What are intentions? For me, intentions are not demands, they are not ultimatums, they are not attempts to control another person. Intentions are the conscious decisions we make about what we are cultivating in our lives. Intentions are purpose in motion. They are the internal compass that guides how we show up in relationships, friendships, business partnerships, and even our relationships with ourselves. When I move with intention, I know what I desire. I know what I value. I know what I am available for and what I no longer willingly, what am I no longer willing to entertain. Not because I am trying to control the outcome, but because I am clear about the direction I am traveling. Intentions require self awareness, they require honesty. They require us to ask ourselves difficult questions. What do I truly desire? What are my values? What standards am I committed to maintaining? What type of relationship am I intentionally building? What type of partner, friend, or leader am I choosing to become? You see, intentions are less about what someone else owes us and more about how we choose to show up. Intention sounds like I desire a healthy relationship. I desire consistency. I desire honesty. I desire commitment. I desire partnership. Notice that these statements are rooted in clarity, not control, because there is a difference. And I think this is where many people become confused. We often think being intentional means demanding that someone immediately give us what we want. But true intentions doesn't force. True intentions reveal. It allows us to communicate honestly and observe whether another person is aligned with what we are building. Being intentional means saying, this is what I desire. This is what I value. This is what I am intentionally cultivating. And then allowing people the freedom to either align with that vision of or not. Which brings me to a question I've been sitting with lately. And I want you to sit with it too. Can I desire commitment without demanding commitment? Take a moment and really think about that. Can I desire commitment without trying to force it? Can I commit my standards without trying to control another person's choice? Can I be honest about what I want while still respecting another person's freedom to choose differently? Because I believe the answer is yes. I can desire commitment. I can value commitment. I can communicate that commitment is important to me. And I can observe whether someone's action aligns with that desire. But the moment I begin demanding commitment from someone who has not chosen it for themselves, I have moved from intention into control. Intentions built consciously. Control attempts to force outcomes. Intentions create space for alignment. Control creates resistance. Intentions say, this is what I am building. Control says, you must build it with me. And there is a powerful difference between the two. So, as we continue this conversation, I want you to reflect on this question. Are you moving through life with intention? Or are you trying to force outcomes that were never yours to control? Because the answer may reveal why certain relationships flourish while others fall apart before they even have the chance to grow. Now, if intentions are about what we are consciously cultivating, then expectations are often about what we believe should happen. And while intentions can create clarity, expectations can sometimes create confusion. Not because expectations are inherently bad. Let's be honest, we all have expectations. We expect honesty. We expect respect. We expect consistency. We expect effort. The challenge isn't having expectations. The challenge is when our expectations become hidden contracts that the other person never agreed to. So, let's talk about expectations. What are they? Expectations are beliefs we hold about how people should behave, what they should provide, and how situations should unfold. Sometimes they're unspoken, but many times they're not. Many expectations exist silently in our minds. And because they are never communicated, they become hidden contracts. You know, those agreements that only one person knows exist. The contracts that sound like, if I text you every day, you should text me every day. If I make time for you, you should make time the same amount of time for me. If we're dating, you should naturally know what I need. If I'm interested in a relationship, you should automatically be moving towards commitment. Yet the truth is, none of those agreements were actually discussed. They were assumed. An assumption can be dangerous because assumptions often cause us to interpret reality through our desires instead of through what is actually happening. Let me say that again. Assumptions cause us to interpret reality through our desires instead of through reality. And when reality fails to match our desires, disappointment is often the result. Not necessarily because the other person did something wrong, but because they failed to fulfill a contract that they never knew exist. Think about how often this shows up in our lives, not just in romantic relationships, in friendships, in family dynamics, and business partnerships. We become frustrated because someone failed to meet an expectation that was never clearly communicated. And before we know it, resentment begins to grow, not because of reality, but because of the story we've created about what reality should have been. Which leads me to another powerful question, one that I've had to ask myself, and one I want you to ask yourself honestly. Am I expecting someone to become who I need them to be? Hmm. Take a moment with that. Am I seeing who they actually are? Or am I seeing their potential? Am I listening to what they are communicating? Or am I listening to what I hope they will eventually become? Am I accepting them where they are? Or am I secretly creating a future version of them in my mind and becoming disappointed when they don't transform into that person? Humans. Because many relationships don't fail because people are bad. They fail because one person is dating who someone is, while the other is dating who they hope that person will become. And there is a difference, a significant difference. Expectations become dangerous when they stop being preferences and start becoming requirements for someone else's transformation. When we stop accepting reality and start negotiating with potential, when we become attached to who someone could be instead of who they are, showing us they are today. And perhaps one of the greatest acts of emotional maturity is learning to separate desire from reality, to desire without attachment, to communicate without control, to observe without forcing, to accept what is instead of becoming consumed by what could be. Because when we do that, we create space for alignment instead of disappointment. And that brings us to the next question. How do we know when we're intentionally building a connection and when we're simply projecting our expectations onto someone else? Now that we explored intentions and expectations, another question naturally began to emerge. What happens when two people aren't necessarily wrong, but they're simply approaching relationships differently? What happens when one person believes connections should unfold naturally while the other believes connections should move with purpose and direction? Is one approach better than the other? I don't necessarily think so. But I do believe that understanding the difference can save us a great deal of confusion, frustration, and heartbreak. So, in this segment, going with the flow versus dating with purpose, one of the most interesting conversations I've had recently centered around this exact topic. The idea of allowing relationships to develop organically versus intentionally pursuing a specific outcome. On one side, there are people who genuinely prefer organic connections. They don't like labels too soon. They don't like pressure. They don't want to force timelines. They believe that if a relationship is meant to grow, it will naturally reveal itself over time. And honestly, there is beauty in that perspective. Because organic connections often create space for presence. They allow people to experience one another without constantly trying to define every moment. There is patience, there is curiosity, there is discovery. You get the opportunity to learn who someone is without immediately placing them in a category. You witness their character, you observe their behavior, you allow the relationship to unfold naturally, and there is wisdom in that. And there is also another perspective. Some people desire clarity and direction, not because they are trying to force an outcome, but because they value intentionality. They want to know whether they're investing their time, energy, and emotions and attention into something that has the potential to grow. They aren't necessarily demanding immediate commitment, they simply appreciate transparency. They appreciate knowing where someone stands. They appreciate conversations about values, goals, and desires. And there is wisdom in that perspective too. Because clarity can reduce confusion, direction can reduce uncertainty, communication can reduce misunderstandings, which is why I don't believe either approach is wrong. The person who values organic connection isn't wrong. The person who values intentional direction isn't wrong. The challenge arises when two people with different approaches assume the other person should operate exactly as they do. And that's where friction begins. That's where misunderstandings grow. That's where disappointment often enters the conversation. Because while one person may feel they're allowing something beautiful to unfold naturally, the other person may feel they're investing emotional energy without understanding where things are headed. Neither person is necessarily wrong. They're simply operating from different relationship philosophies. And this is where alignment becomes so important. not agreement, alignment. Because two people don't have to share every thought, every understanding, every move, every preference, every opinion. But they do need to understand how each other moves, how each other communicates, how each other builds trust, how each other approaches relationships. Alignment allows both people to make informed choices without pressure, without manipulation, without resentment, without pretending to be someone they're not. Because the truth is, organic connections without communication can sometimes create challenges. It can take or it can create a lack of clarity. It can create emotional confusion. It can create mixed signals. One person believes everything is progressing naturally. The other person is wondering whether the relationship is progressing at all. One person feels relaxed, the other feels uncertain. One person believes they're giving the relationship room to breathe, the other feels left guessing. And whenever uncertainty is left unaddressed for too long, people often begin creating stories to fill in the gaps. Stories based on fear, stories based on assumptions, stories based on past wounds, and those stories can damage connections that may have otherwise had potential. So perhaps the goal isn't choosing between going with the flow or dating with purpose. Perhaps the goal is understanding which approach aligns with your values and communicating that honestly. Because when two people understand how each other moves, they create something powerful. Not control, not pressure, not expectations, but mutual understanding. And sometimes mutual understanding is the very thing that allows a connection to flourish. So, the question I want to leave you with is this: do you genuinely prefer organic connections? Do you genuinely prefer clarity and direction? Or have you ever taken the time to identify your relationship philosophy at all? Because understanding how you move may be the first step towards finding someone whose path naturally aligns with yours. As we've been exploring intentions, expectations, and relationship philosophies, there is one word that seemed to surface over and over again in modern dating conversations: consistency. Almost everyone says they want it. Almost everyone says it's important. Yet, when you ask people what consistency actually means, you'll often discover that everyone has a different definition. And that's where things get interesting because sometimes the problem isn't that someone is inconsistent. The problem is that two people are measuring consistency by completely different standards. Segment 4: the consistency conversation. So let's talk about consistency. What is consistency? Consistency is the ability to repeatedly demonstrate behaviors, values, actions, and commitments over time. It's showing up in a way that people can reasonably trust and depend upon. But here's what I've learned: consistency isn't just frequency. Let me say that again. Consistency is not just frequency. Some people define consistency by how often they hear from someone, how often they text, how often they call, how often they spend time together. And while frequency can certainly be a part of consistency, frequency alone doesn't tell the whole story. Because someone can text you every day and still be inconsistent. Someone can call you every morning and still lack integrity. Someone can communicate frequently and still fail to follow through on what they say, which is why I believe consistency is deeper than communication frequency. Consistency is reliability. Can I trust your words and your actions to align? Consistency is integrity. Do you operate according to the values you claim to hold? Consistency is follow through. When you make a commitment, do your actions support it? Consistency is emotional stability. Do I know who I'm engaging with from one interaction to the next? Consistency is effort, not perfection, but effort. Because life happens, work happens, family happens, unexpected circumstances happen. Consistency isn't about being available every moment of every day. It's about demonstrating a reliable pattern of behaviors over time. And here's where many people get stuck. One person defines consistency as daily communication. Another defines consistency as keeping promises. One person defines consistency as frequent interactions. Another defines consistency as dependable actions. One person wants quantity. The other values quality. Neither person is necessarily wrong. They're simply measuring consistency differently. And when those definitions are never discussed, misunderstandings are almost guaranteed. One person feels neglected, the other feels unfairly judged. One person believes they're showing up consistently, the other person doesn't experience it that way. And suddenly, both people are frustrated, not because they don't care, but because they're speaking different relational languages. Which brings me to a question that completely changed the way I approach relationships. A question I believe we should ask much earlier. Instead of asking, do they like me? What if we asked, are our relationship values compatible? Sit with that for a moment. Because someone can genuinely like you and still not be compatible with you. Someone can enjoy your company and still not share your values. Someone can be attached to you and still approach relationships in a way that doesn't align with your needs. And that's not necessarily a failure. That's information, valuable information. Perhaps one of the healthiest things we can do is stop focusing solely on whether someone likes us and start paying attention to how they move. How do they communicate? How do they handle conflict? How do they define commitment? How do they define consistency? Or how do they spend their time? How do they honor their word? How do they build trust? Because compatibility is often found in shared values, not shared attraction. And the sooner we learn that, the sooner we stop taking every misalignment personally. Sometimes people aren't rejecting us. Sometimes they're simply revealing that they move differently than we do. And rather than asking whether someone likes us enough, perhaps the better question is this: can we realistically build something healthy together based on the values we both bring to the table? Because attraction may start a relationship, but compatibility is often what sustains it. And understanding the difference may save us from investing ourselves into connections that we never truly aligned with from the beginning. I have some reflection questions for you humans. Am I dating for connection, companionship, commitment, or validation? That's question one. Question two: do I communicate my needs clearly? Question three: have I confused hope with reality? Question four: am I honoring my standards? Question five: how long am I willing to sit in uncertainty? So, humans, we are coming to a brief ending of episode one, Intentions versus Expectations, part one. I've learned that not everyone who enters our lives is meant to walk beside us forever. Some people arrive to teach us about ourselves. Sometimes the lesson isn't whether they choose us. Sometimes the lesson is whether we choose ourselves, whether we honor our needs, whether we trust what people are showing us, and whether we have the courage to walk away from confusion and walk towards clarity. So, humans, all I ask for you is to spend some time reflecting on those questions this week. Write them down, journal about them, meditate on them, sit with them. You may be surprised by what rises to the surface. So, thank you for spending time with me. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey. And remember, your life is not defined by where you started. It is shaped by the intentions you choose to live by every single day. Until next time, continue growing, healing, becoming, and seek what is missing. Ashe, Ashe, away.